attention of the House by way of an urgent debate. I call upon Honourable Damien O'Connor to move that the House take note of an urgent matter of public importance.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Honourable Damien O'Connor.
Mr Speaker, last week we received from the Auditor General a report that was perhaps one of the most alarming things to be tabled in Parliament over the last 12 months. Mr Speaker, this report in brief said that we are not prepared for an outbreak of foot and mouth in this country. Mr Speaker, there will be many members, the Speaker himself,
Order.
I'm sure.
Members, please show some courtesy.
Mr Speaker, who are aware of the significance of our primary industries and of the constant threat to each and every one of those sectors through foot and mouth. Mr Speaker, as the Auditor General's overview said, quote, "Our country is more dependent on biosecurity than any other developed country. Biosecurity is fundamental to New Zealand's economic health and natural heritage," Mr Speaker. Well, no truer statement could be written down, and no truer commitment to New Zealand's future could be made than that from a government that properly funds, properly resources and shows commitment to biosecurity. What did the national government do when it came into power? Well, Mr Speaker, the very first budget cut over $2 million from frontline services for biosecurity, and ongoing cuts resulted, Mr Speaker, in 96 frontline staff being chopped from biosecurity New Zealand. Mr Speaker, at that time, the government came back saying, well, what did Labor do in government? In government, we doubled the amount of funding for biosecurity from 1999 through into 2008. Doubled the commitment to biosecurity. We still knew that it wasn't perfect, but we'd doubled the funding, we'd formed Biosecurity New Zealand as a separate entity within the Ministry of Agriculture and Forestry, a separate entity focused on protecting New Zealand from biosecurity risk. We had then instructed them to undertake a strategic review and develop a strategic plan for biosecurity moving forward, because Labor in government both recognised, acknowledged and funded biosecurity as the most important area, more important than military security, Mr Speaker, and we've doubled the funding, we've done a lot in that area, the national government goes on about it, but biosecurity is, as the Auditor General's review said, Mr Speaker, is one of the most fundamental and important issues for our economy. Mr Speaker, we still get 30 to 40 incursions, that's unwanted pests and diseases coming into this country every single year. The ability of the professionals, and I would like to acknowledge the people who have worked in biosecurity, they do an outstanding job. But in the last 4 years, I have been contacted by a large number who have left the job. They simply cannot commit to their conscience, cannot in all honesty say that they can remain in the job and do it properly under the cuts that have been forced upon them by the national government and by the faults that this Auditor General's report clearly identified, Mr Speaker. So firstly, in 2009, we had cuts to frontline services. The Auditor General's report doesn't actually address the border security issues. It actually looks behind the scenes to where we were told by the Minister, had been told on numerous occasions, the former Minister in particular, that New Zealand's biosecurity system is world class. World class, the Minister has repeated in this House numerous times and through press releases, Mr Speaker. Well, if it's world class, it's simply not good enough. We have 30 to 40 incursions every year. The Auditor General's report says that planning is not up to it, not only for the single biggest threat, foot and mouth, but in all other areas of biosecurity, strategic planning, training, Mr Speaker, human relations management, staff training, you name it, there are huge, huge gaps. The recommendations are very clear, Mr. Speaker. We've got in the Auditor General's report, Mr. Speaker, an identification of the lack of leadership. This comes squarely back to the government, Mr. Speaker, because if you do not have a minister who's prepared to lead in their portfolio area, you will not have a government department, Mr. Speaker, not you, perhaps the former Speaker who was in the chair, but not you, Mr. Speaker. If you don't have the leadership, you don't have the strategic vision, and you do not have the effectiveness of the department. Mr. Speaker, I'll go through a few of the recommendations. It says that we should have all biosecurity planning more realistic. Mr. Speaker, there has been, from Biosecurity New Zealand, going back probably more than 4 years, some ambitious targets. Those targets were on the basis of funding that was committed by the last Labor government. We doubled the funding, remember, Mr. Speaker? The funding that was going to be consistent to all areas of biosecurity in New Zealand. They had ambitious targets. There was no doubt about that. The Auditor General says so. But the Auditor General says that they were unrealistic, particularly given the constraints on resources that the incoming national government placed on biosecurity, Mr. Speaker. It is no good making false promises or assurances when you can't deliver. That's what the Auditor General said. Mr. Speaker, the second recommendation, to complete response plans for high-risk organisms, including foot and mouth diseases, and review them at regular intervals. Mr. Speaker, we had the fruit fly outbreak, a major scare in this country. The single biggest threat to the horticultural industry is the Queensland fruit fly. We had one fly identified in Auckland, Mr. Speaker, and this report says that the response plans were not complete, that in fact we weren't in a situation, had that outbreak been real, had the number of flies been far more than the one, we weren't in a situation to handle that incursion properly, Mr. Speaker. Again, the third one, clearly identifying the foot and mouth disease, it says we simply have to prepare better. There was exercise tourists in 2012. In fact, going back prior to that, we had a suspected foot and mouth outbreak, and there were lessons learned. Unfortunately, the lessons have not been implemented into better processes for Biosecurity New Zealand. In fact, I have to be upfront and say, of course, we've got rid of Biosecurity New Zealand. In fact, now the national government in getting rid of Biosecurity New Zealand, put it back into a super ministry called the Ministry for Primary Industries, Mr. Speaker, that deals with issues from trade through to food safety, forestry, Mr. Speaker, fishing and biosecurity. Little wonder then that the issues of biosecurity get hosed down, Mr. Speaker, will be suppressed, compromised by the trade negotiators, a number of whom will be with the Prime Minister in South America at the moment, promising to open doors, to increase the trade, which we need. I understand, we all understand, but not at the expense of biosecurity standards. Mr. Speaker, the staff capability that was something we were very proud of under Biosecurity New Zealand has been compromised. Because of the constraints on resources, on finance, Mr. Speaker, the planning, the support, the training for each and every area of biosecurity has been compromised, and the Auditor General clearly identifies that, Mr. Speaker. Can I say that we are today, tomorrow, facing threat from incursions, Mr. Speaker, and one in particular that I'd like to raise that we have not, I think, properly assessed because of the constraint on resources is the one of palm kernel expelliar. That is the supplementary feed brought in from Malaysia and from a couple of other Asian countries to feed cows. Supplementary feeding, for the most part, actually in times of drought, essential feeding. I acknowledge that. However, there has been a report done by farmers who went to Malaysia, who asked to go to a factory where this product was made. It is a byproduct of the palm oil industry, Mr. Speaker. They wrote a report that is quite alarming and sent that to the Ministry for Primary Industries, Mr. Speaker, and we have yet to hear a dicky bird from the Ministry. Mr. Speaker, that report says that palm kernel is coming into this country. It is potentially exposed to animals, to vermin, who are in themselves exposed to foot and mouth endemic areas, and we are fearful that we may allow into this country, because of insufficient monitoring by an under-resourced, underprepared, and not unskilled but unprepared, and I guess a group of people who haven't had the support and sufficient training in the last few years. We're going to allow into this country foot and mouth through palm kernel expel. That would be a disastrous situation. At a time when farmers are looking for more supplementary feed, it is going to come in greater volumes. We want to know that the Ministry for Primary Industries and the national government is going to resource the ministry to ensure that we do not get foot and mouth in this country. Mr. Speaker, this is quite a substantive report. I applaud and acknowledge the independence of the Auditor General's work. It is first class. It does not pull punches, Mr. Speaker, but it is alarming. Mr. Speaker, if the government doesn't act on the recommendations, it's like placing a bomb in the middle of the room here and waiting for it to go off. Because one thing is for sure, that without major improvements in both the resourcing, the planning, the training, the preparedness of our biosecurity team, then we are going to face a major problem, Mr. Speaker. PSA is destroying the kiwifruit industry as we speak. PSA identified flaws in the system, Mr. Speaker. We were told that the government was moving to improve that system. The Auditor General says otherwise. The Auditor General has said our biosecurity system is not world-class. In fact, it is deficient. For a country, oh, Nick Smith, yeah, he's over there. He's been one of the ministers who sat on his hands, squeezed resources for this vital area, and then he'll go around the country and say, oh, I'm Minister of Conservation. It is not only the primary sectors that are threatened by biosecurity incursions, it is the conservation estate, and the minister should wake up to that fact. It's in fact all our natural heritage, Mr. Speaker. It is our economy threatened each and every day, and the Auditor General says, Mr. Speaker, that we are not prepared. We are not prepared as a country, and unless Nick Smith and his colleagues and his cronies are prepared to put more money, more focus and more resources, he and his colleagues will be responsible for the destruction of our economy. Because if foot and mouth comes in here, Mr. Speaker, we'll all be paupers, and that is the truth of it. Mr. Speaker, I go back to one of the first statements made by the Auditor General. Our country is more dependent on biosecurity than any other developed country. Biosecurity is fundamental to New Zealand's economic health and natural heritage. And the Minister of Conservation, sitting on his chuff over there, should listen to that. The natural heritage that we use to draw tourists to this country, that we're so proud of in our 100% pure image, Mr. Speaker, is dependent upon us keeping out unwanted pests and diseases. Mr. Speaker, I applaud the Auditor General. I hope that there will be a report in 2 years' time when we come into government, Mr. Speaker, that clearly identifies a drastic improvement, because the government has for once decided to put resources into the right areas of government responsibility. Mr. Speaker, I applaud this report, I table it, and I seek help from the government to take some action on it.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I recognise the Honourable Minister Joe Goodhue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I wish to begin